internet radio show devoted to the culture of consciousness. We are on the internet, of course. Radio is only a euphemism, a metaphor from an older era of communications technology. And, of course, at this point in the game, it's a pretty trite and obvious thing to say that the internet is probably one of the most revolutionary developments in the last 15, 20 years in terms of politics, culture, and even consciousness to some degree. And the internet presents a really interesting problem because it's like, how do you understand it? How do you map this immense space that is now permeated and entered into every dimension of our lives? It presents a different kind of problem to journalism, to cultural understanding, because it doesn't exist in the same way as the things we see in our ordinary lives, and yet it's completely permeated. It has completely permeated those spaces of our life. And I've been interested in the cultures of the internet since the early 1990s, and our guest today is someone that I met at that time, who has also been covering many dimensions of internet culture or cultures since that time. A fellow named Julian Dibbell, who we'll get to in just a second. But one of the things that the internet presents is this sort of anthropological challenge. How do you go out and understand worlds that are not yours? We tend to gravitate towards those things that we want, towards the things that mirror our own interests and our own desires. And given the fact that like-minded communities can form so easily on the internet, it's very easy to find oneself hanging out with people you more or less agree with, or if you don't agree with them, you at least agree with on the terms or the topics that have drawn you there. And yet at the same time, all around us are all these other affinity groups who are organized not just by different interests, but whole new emerging ways of being communities, of exploring this ever-expanding technological environment that's constantly mutating and changing the ways that it deals with information and the way that it deals with connecting people. The more recent example, of course, is the rise of social networks and how that's already changing politics and culture and the way people communicate with one another, forms like Twitter or Facebook. And we watch them become mainstream, and then suddenly we realize that what was once a odd little internet fad has become something that is woven into the fabric of our lives, and then a year or two later, it's gone again. So it requires a very kind of facile, quick-minded, and anthropological approach, in my mind, to really begin to probe some of these outer zones that if you don't pay attention to, you're never really going to know about, and yet can end up sneaking up and really transforming the way that we move through the world and experience things. So I'm very devoted to this idea, and I know Julian is as well. And Maja, our Expanding Minds' own esoteric librarian. What kind of internet user are you? Do you dive into intense fandoms and bulletin boards, or are you sort of a restrained nethead?
I'm afraid that's top secret information, Eric. My internet business is none of your business. No, I do some involvement. I certainly, I don't even have a cell phone myself, but I do use like Facebook and MySpace to keep in touch with people. I don't go onto some of these internet communities, but I'm very fascinated by them because my sister does the Final Fantasy online game, and she actually met her fiancé on there, and I always think it's interesting, which is something I know Julian talks about, is the crossover. You know, a lot of people think, well, maybe not a lot that are in them, but people that aren't involved in them think like the internet is this separate place, and kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, that, you know, maybe what happens in these online communities stays there, but it crosses over into our real lives. Like you said, it's a mirror, and these things that, you know, it's not this kind of removed thing that exists in cyberspace. It also translates into our real lives. So
very much.
Yeah, totally.
And that's something that's really happened over time as well. I mean, again, in the early to mid-1990s, when I first started writing and covering and exploring the internet and online communities, sort of the proto-game worlds of MUDs and MOOs and listservs and discovering all these underground and alternative communities that were organizing themselves online, there was very much of a sense of this emerging space as a separate place.
Yeah.
People used the term cyberspace quite widely at that point, and they were drawing it from a science fiction novel from William Gibson's Neuromancer, and the idea was that there was kind of this separate, three-dimensional, interactive world of data where you could sort of leave your body and enter this new world and take on a new identity, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a really dominant metaphor for the more cultural rather than pragmatic aspects of early Internet culture. And,
totally.
And then there was a certain point it reached, as the years went by, where it became clear that that was not really an adequate metaphor anymore, because the Internet was becoming so much a part of our everyday lives, and becoming, in some sense, less and less enchanting, less and less a magical other world, and more like business as usual, which tends to be the way that communication technologies enter in and shake up our world and then become very ordinary. I mean, when the telephone first entered into society, it was a very enchanted, odd, magical instrument, because it's like this object that talks to you with voices from people that are far away. It was a very, must have been very curious for a few months for the people who were using them. But then we get used to it, and now it's just a public utility. We see the same thing with Facebook or things like that. So it's very interesting to see how the Internet remains both a place of real cultural creation and yet also becomes just another aspect of our ordinary experience.
And through those aspects, we have the more kind of negative ones, too, which Julian talks about, like how crimes are committed in these places. And, I mean, certainly, like, Dateline covers the crossover there, with busting all the Internet pedophiles and things like that. But even things that happen within the communities on cyberspace that aren't really in real life, but then they do something in the avatars in cyberspace and how that affects people. To me, that's very interesting, because it's like it does kind of exist in this other place, but then it's affecting you because you're doing it. It gets really complicated.
It does get very complicated, and maybe to help iron out some of these complications, we'll bring on Julian Dibbell. Julian, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind. Julian, are you there? Oh, he does not seem to be there.
I am here. I'm talking. Are you not hearing?
There we are.
Hello.
Well, welcome to the show.
Howdy.
So I want to start off talking about your most recently published foray into Internet culture, which is looking at this great sort of griefer war between a very peculiar and interesting subset of Internet hounds and the infamous Church of Scientology. Can you tell me a little bit more about the actors in this particular engagement that you wrote about recently in Wired magazine?
Well, maybe since Maja brought it up, maybe I should take it all the way back to the beginning of my career, when I wrote an article that is something I came to be known for, and kind of framed my initial entree into online communities and the way that kinds of acts of aggression can unfold and have repercussions. And this was an article called "A Rape in Cyberspace" that ran in the Village Voice in 1993, talking about an online community that was a kind of fantasy of a little cozy house, and into it came this character who described himself as a sort of creepy clown and used some of the online tools that were available in this fantasy world to enact fantasies of rape on the other players, on the other avatars, but that had a really powerful valence, more than just being role play to these people, because they felt that their avatars kind of embodied themselves in this world. They felt actually transgressed. And that was what I was focusing on, was the transgression and how the community responded to this, and how they organized to sort of create their own system of self-governance to deal with this kind of transgression. So, highlighting that element that Maja was talking about, that there can be kinds of transgression online within the community itself that are felt as serious violations.
Crimes even, really.
It's interesting that it's through the aggressive or negative experiences that the kind of truth of the investment comes to the fore. It's like when you're in an online environment or a game world and you're having a good time and you're playing, there's a sort of sense of expansiveness or entertainment or even deep emotional engagement. But it's easy to think of like, oh, we're just kind of playing. And yet when there's a sort of aggressively negative act or a destructive act or a obviously quote-unquote sociopathic act, then suddenly one's real investment in this space becomes more evident.
Right. And so that's what I was highlighting at. And for that purpose, just kind of blackboxing the mind of the character who had come and committed this grievance. Like, well, put him to the side. Well, he's a sociopath. Let's not really, inquire into what he was thinking. But the interesting thing is that over the years, this act of coming into a cozy online community and making trouble and upsetting everybody has developed a really elaborate culture around it. So in gaming, in online gaming, this is known as the culture of griefing, but more generally, it's referred to as trolling, right? The classic character who will go into like the online cat lovers mailing list and start posting recipes for kitten stew, just to try to get everybody riled up, and then we'll sit back and laugh as everyone rises to the bait and sends angry emails and so forth. And for a long time we just wrote these people off as sociopaths, but they've created their own culture, and you can and so I started looking into that, and it led me to groups like the Something Awful Goons in Second Life, who have made a point of going in and harassing the furries there, who are people who like to role play as erotic animals and so forth. And that led me finally to the sort of the mother source of all trolling on the internet, which is the online bulletin board 4chan, which is the source, interestingly, of some of our favorite ridiculous online memes, like the lolcat memes started there.
Can you explain what the lolcat meme is?
Lolcat meme.
We have not all been infected.
Okay,
I love the lolcats, so.
If you haven't been infected yet, maybe it's about to happen now. Lolcats are endless variations on little pictures of cute kittens, like the old posters you used to see, "Hang in there, baby," picture of a kitten hanging on it. But they've created an elaborate, ridiculous language of kitty cats that's sort of at once a mockery of these cute inspirational posters and an extension of them. So, there's the little cat, peering into the refrigerator, and it's, subheaded, "I can has cheeseburger." It doesn't obviously translate very well into the medium of the over-the-phone interview by radio, but go search on lolcats and you'll get the idea. The point is that these are things like, for instance, or the Rickroll, where you click on a link that somebody says, "Oh, you should definitely check this out," and it's the video of Rick Astley singing "Never Gonna Get You Up," and you're busted, and you've been forced to watch this horrible video. But these are jokes that go spewing out like literally like viruses, and so that's another metaphor, the viral culture. Memes, all that stuff is sort of, well, you've talked a lot about it too, and there's a lot to mine there. But the point is, we have this idea of them as sort of emerging from out of nowhere, but in fact a lot of them begin on these message boards like 4chan, which do an interesting thing with the whole relationship between identity and expression online, which is to enforce anonymity on everybody. Not pseudonymity, which we're familiar with, right? Like the Muds and Moos and all the online games. You go in and you take on a character, but after a while you're known by that name. I could be Dr. Bombay online, and eventually people would know me as Dr. Bombay and have a sense of me. But in these anonymous boards, it's kind of like, everybody's sitting in a hot tub in the dark, and you hear people making jokes, but you don't know who's making them, right? It's like this dissolution of identity into this collective creative identity, and it's incredibly creative, and it's also incredibly cruel and juvenile, and so you have at the same time these hilarious lowbrow jokes are emerging from this place. You also have this very advanced culture of trolling, where periodically people will band together and say, look, this website here is ridiculous, we need to go troll the crap out of it, and they will go and start harassing the people who hang out there. And
that's a good segue, because if I'm not mistaken, as you wrote, 4chan was where that group Anonymous kind of really, got popular as far as their Scientology sort of tirades that they went off. And you write about that. Do you want to talk about like how Anonymous came out of the griefers or the trollers?
Well, yes, that is exactly the segue. I mean, that Anonymous isn't even a group. I mean, that's kind of a misnomer. Anonymous is itself a meme, and it's a 4chan meme where, because they recognize themselves as capable of agency, of getting together and banding together to go out and harass sites, they need somehow to ascribe an identity to the being that is doing that stuff. And because the only name they know each other by is Anonymous, every post on 4chan is signed Anonymous, that's the name they gave to this collective beast, this collective entity. And they have a whole mythology, very elaborated, around that identity. And so when a certain subset of these people got it in their heads to go start trolling Scientology, to take them on, to bring them down, they identified as Anonymous, naturally. Not in the sense of, constituting a formal group called Anonymous, but in the sense of, we're doing this without any formal organization, without any formal leadership. We are Anonymous.
It seems really fascinating because, in reading a lot of speculations about the Internet and about the future of human consciousness as it's mediated increasingly through these networks of data and online networks, et cetera, there's a lot of talk of the hive mind, of a kind of collective mind emerging. And most of the time, it's used as a sort of kind of vague metaphor that you can kind of just describe general phenomena with. But in this case, it really seems something very specific and very real, in the sense that by stripping away a personal, a personal identity, you actually create a space of a kind of collective character, a collective force, an egregore in magical terminology that does go out and do things and make change, in this case political change,
right,
to some degree, but without really being able to trace it back to any individual production. I mean, it's a really fascinating development. It seems like a real hive mind in that sense.
Right, and that was what originally fascinated me about it, and the fact that this inchoate organism could act coherently, and they did. I mean, it started out as just doing, trying to bring down the Scientology website, and they did that for a while, and things started to go kind of haywire, and the movement started to get kind of a bad rep. Like, these people are no better than Scientology, which was being attacked for trying to, delete a Tom Cruise video from YouTube, and the point was, well, how is this any better? You guys are just trying to shut down their speech as well. And they kind of somehow said, well, that's right, this isn't working, let's do something else. And they shifted tactics to real-life raiding, to actually showing up outside the offices, outside the Scientology centers, and doing these crazy protests where they were dressing up in Guy Fawkes masks and playing Rick Astley on their boomboxes and bringing the meme culture to the very door of Scientology, and in an impressive way. I mean, they got close to 10,000 people to come out, and they were doing this on a monthly basis. They would sort of all collectively figure out what day they were all going to do this, and at Scientology centers around the world, these guys would show up and start making noise. Now that's impressive, and especially in the context, like you said, of political change, it's particularly impressive because there's been a lot of examples of kind of flash mob activism over the years. You know, you've had going back to the battle for Seattle, you know, coordinating by cell phones and things, and the protests that arose in Spain after the bombings, I think in 2003 it was, where you're kind of spontaneously getting people out on the streets to just make noise and make trouble. But I talked to Clay Shirky about this when I was researching this. He said the thing that had never been seen before was a group that was constituted as a hive mind, that had no obvious leadership structure or formal structure, but that was able to not just do things tactically, just, you know, sort of spontaneously get people on the streets as, you know, around an emergency issue, but to sustain a long-term movement with, you know, actual strategy rather than tactics. In other words, that they were able to shift tactics showed that they had a strategy over and above that. And that's, to me, the thing that's most impressive about what's come to be called Project Chanology, or Anonymous's campaign against Scientology.
I mean, one way of looking at it, maybe this is a little bit, you know, not derogatory, but a little bit simplistic, but is that, you know, there is something like, mob reaction. That there is something like a mob. It happens, you know, if you look at political history, you can find many moments when political tensions are such that some very trivial event sets off a mob reaction that then goes in, often through violence and destruction, creates a situation that winds up affecting real change. It almost seems like this is like an intelligent and sort of, digitally coherent form of some of that same inchoate energy. Like it's very much bottom up rather than top down. And one of the interesting tensions that you described in your article was that as it became clear that this was in many ways an effective campaign, that at least people were hearing about it. There was thousands and thousands of people were being were sort of self-organizing on a regular basis to take down or to protest a group that most people would agree is not the best thing for the world. That there was kind of a moral implication or an ethical dimension to their activity. There arose within the protesters a kind of a debate between those who saw this as an ethical good to be protected and intensified even, and others who were worried that the flavor of the movement would be lost as it became more ethically coherent. And instead, they had to make sure that it remained scatological and adolescent and silly and mean in some sense. That's a very odd and fascinating tension.
I thought it was really fascinating, and I thought it was really important to convey that because people will, I think, look at the formal nature of it, that, they were able to do things, in a hive mind, bottom-up fashion. Let's go do that. We have our moral cause. Let's go do that, without thinking through, the sort of psychic, attitudinal elements that helped constitute this movement too, without understanding that, you can't just, a mob is angry, it's pissed off, and it's having fun too. But you're exactly right. It is, in this case, a lot more intelligent than your typical mob, and it is, effective to some extent. I mean, I've gotten some blowback from Anonymous itself about this article because, I questioned how much they've actually achieved in terms of actually bringing down Scientology, which is a subtle question to try to unravel, but that's the case often with political movements.
Well, let's actually talk about it. Talk about Scientology a little bit more, because
sure.
I think it's, to my mind anyway, it's very clear that one of the reasons this was able to happen, and to happen in an effective, ongoing way, was because of the nature of the target, of the object of Scientology itself, which is, it's important to say, also has its own long and tangled history with Internet protests. Like, there's something very particular about Scientology as an organization, both in terms of their relationship to information control and their general sort of cultural profile, that makes them incredibly ripe targets for a sort of Internet-based, youthful, pro-information freedom kind of political, cultural attitude. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you've been tracking this for a long time, a little bit about Scientology and its relationship to Internet and Internet protests?
Well, okay, so the thing about Scientology is that, we can argue or not about whether it's a religion, but it's unique among spiritual movements in its emphasis on intellectual property. And that's because, to be a Scientologist, to be on the path, the bridge to enlightenment, is to be going from one level to the next of your understanding of the writings, the copyrighted writings of L. Ron Hubbard, and paying, for access to those writings and, various lesson plans and things that will take you to the next level. And so because that's, actually almost a doctrinal part of it is that you pay for information. They actually feel that it is a more moral relationship to be paying for this knowledge than to be just sort of in a relationship where you're getting it, as charity. So that means IP, the church's intellectual property, is sort of at the root of everything, and not in the way that the Bible is at the root of Christianity, not the words themselves, but the words as intellectual property, right? So one of the things that happened early on in the history of the Internet was that critics of Scientology got hold of some of these more secret writings, which also, of course, it's very important that they are copyrighted, because that gives them a way to regulate the dissemination of them. But the secret writings that you get access to when you reach a certain level, at which point you've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars perhaps in your Scientology training, got out onto some Internet, some Usenet news groups, and became the subject of a very intense online war between Scientology and its critics, where Scientology was trying to both suppress messages in the Usenet groups that contain some of this stuff, and going after people that had disseminated some of this information, and a lot of this is around the Xenu mythology, which people are familiar with, perhaps from South Park's hilarious explications of Scientology, and going after them, with the legal backing, with the legal leverage of their copyright ownership.
Well, and they actually did that even before the Internet, like when William Burroughs' Naked Scientology book came out, which is a fantastic book. They actually had it, they sued and had it removed while it was on the trucks being delivered to the bookstores. So I mean, the amount of effort that they go to rescind this information that comes out about them extends not only on the Internet but into people's lives everywhere. Right. Like, it's really dominating. It goes into all aspects of our society.
But that's this notion we've been talking about extending beyond the Internet into people's lives. Well, really, another way of looking at it is people's lives are extending into the Internet anyway, and there is this kind of lubricating mojo on the Internet that turns the regular, everyday exchanges of information that we're always doing into something much more powerful and fast, right? And so this stuff was circulating out there much faster on the internet, and so Scientology was coming down much harder and fighting a broader war once this happened, to the point where I don't know, how far your listeners go back with internet history, but in the early days there was this server that was an anonymizing server in Finland that made it possible for people to post anonymously to these user groups, and it was encrypted, and it was a great thing for whistleblowers, and a kind of something that was always pointed to about how the internet was going to make anonymous, wide-scale communications possible and change all kinds of political balances. Well, this server, pnet.fi, was a casualty of these Scientology wars, because some of these messages were being posted through that server, and Scientology got, basically a warrant to go and search the server. And that was that. The guy who was running it said, well, basically, I cannot guarantee anyone's anonymity, so I give up. So yeah, it goes way back, and it's very intense. But you're right. I mean, one of the things that started fascinating me as I looked at the two groups, Anonymous and Scientology, was the extent to which they are almost Manichaean mirror images of each other in terms of their relationship to information control.
And it goes into the self-policing thing, which you talk about, in your Rape in Cyberspace, how these groups have to kind of police themselves. Well, that happens in Anonymous and in Scientology, too. Scientology has their own inside police group, which actually William Burroughs talks about in his book, too, which is fascinating. They don't go to the cops, unless they need warrants for people, to search their computers and stuff like that. But Anonymous, it was the same thing. They would have this kind of internal way that they would deal with their members and organize and have people go about doing things. And then, like you said, in the little groups, trying to figure out how to deal with the griefers, then you have to kind of, make your own little policing systems. And so those mirrors of organization of the groups is that you talked about, I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I want to be careful, though, when I talk about mirroring, to clarify. I think the kind of because of the nature of the differences in the ways they deal with information control, the nature of the controls on membership and on people's attitudes is very different and a lot creepier, I think, in the case of Scientology. Than in online communities, although there is always an element of repression in the way any group sets norms for itself and enforces them, either by mockery of people who transgress, or or ignoring them, all kinds of ways that people have of doing that. But whereas within Scientology you are subject to constant monitoring. You have to go in for these monitoring sessions all the time, and there's a lot of sort of getting at what people are thinking through that. It's very different, but particularly around the sort of sacred texts that constitute the group. I mean, Anonymous, given that nobody knows who each other is and who's writing what, sort of draws its coherence from this body of texts and memes that it's developed over these years. We know each other because we share these memes. And they have this website, Encyclopedia Dramatica, that is hilarious and mind-bogglingly awful and funny and cruel and all sorts of things, but is an elaborate mythology of sort of who we are. Whereas Scientology has a body of text too, but it is the writings of one man, and they're incredibly controlled, and the whole shape of both organizations sort of derives from those initial relationships.
And they also very much reflect this immense historical technological shift we're involved in, because it's quite clear that in most, perhaps even always, that the sort of hierarchical organization of controlling, based on controlling information, is kind of on the way out.
Right.
That almost everything that we're seeing now in terms of new forms of social organization are moving in this direction of emergence, of collectivity, of new networks, of ways of organizing multitudes, and they may not end up completely, shifting the course of things. But I think that it's not simply a matter of political organization or an attitude towards whether you have an open or closed information system, but it's actually a much broader psychological and cultural shift that is moving in this direction of open networks, of new forms of collectivity. But I wanted to ask you a specific question. You had to go. You went and talked to the Scientologists. A lot of people have a lot of fear around them. That's one of the things I find very interesting about Scientology, and one of the reasons I think that this campaign could work against Scientology is that there's a sort of baseline mixture of kind of disgust and feeling of creepiness and fear that a lot of people have around, the organization or even individual Scientologists. And I'm just curious how you found going and interviewing them and dealing with them in terms of this article, and whether you had any concerns about your own bank account, your dog, or whatever you might
dog.
Freak out about them targeting. But what was your experience with them?
My experience was, the creeps I got tended to be more secondhand. I was hanging out with the anonymous protesters, particularly in L.A., going to a lot of the classic, Scientology sites in Hollywood to watch them protest, and there was always one or two or three Scientologists there watching them, kind of standing nearby, hovering with video cameras, and they knew these guys, and they were the same ones all the time. And as I talked to the Scientologists, to the channelologists, to the anonymous protesters, they had all these stories of, yes, being followed by private detectives afterwards, after the protests, and I saw them following us, into the subway in L.A., waiting for the protesters to take off their masks, and take pictures. And people's, though the anonymity in the real life protesters is a big part of how it works. Almost all of the regular protesters have been identified by Scientology, named, and their neighborhoods flyered with pamphlets saying, this person so and so is your neighbor and is a member of a terrorist organization, anonymous. And the ones who have some of the protesters have been really rattled by this and have dropped out and signed affidavits swearing they were dupes of Scientology critics and stuff. But the ones who have stuck with it have been like, do they understand, that this kind of tactic doesn't work in this day and age? I don't live in a village, where
it kind of works sometimes. Like, a little while ago, there was that guy that they made so crazy and scared. This happened at the Celebrity Center in Los Angeles a few months ago. He actually went up and attacked the Scientology Center with a samurai sword, and then they shot him. And what I read about it was that he got driven to that from harassment by the Scientology group. So it can get really...
I'm not saying it. I'm going. My point is, it was something that was a forceful response, and it definitely pressured some people, and it hardened other people. But it was creepy. It was a very very surveillant sort of situation. My own attempts to talk to any of the Scientologists at the protests were completely shut down. They were like, no, we're not talking to the press. Every time I tried to talk to them, they would not talk. It all had to go through Tommy Davis. Tommy Davis is their sort of national spokesman, the daughter of Ann Archer, and total Hollywood type kid, who is now the go-to guy for the press. And he had me into the Celebrity Center, up to a suite on the 13th floor, and where I was subjected to all these DVDs about how awful Anonymous was, and he had this huge list of all the crimes of Anonymous. And I did make the jokey calls to my friends. If I don't come out by this afternoon, send in the SWAT team. But it was more this sense you had of he was just. I just felt that I was being worn down with his endless spew of information about why Scientology was great and why Anonymous was evil. I had this sense that he was using Hubbarddian techniques on me, but those are not that much different than any PR person's techniques anyway. So it was less scary than just kind of unnerving.
Well, it's very much a part of the culture, particularly of Los Angeles. I mean, I when I wrote the Visionary State, and I had a chapter in the book since I was looking at alternative religion in California, where I wanted to go and go to the Celebrity Center and have them run me through an e-meter, and then they showed me their weird movie, and I didn't want to go alone just because I thought it would be more comfortable if I wasn't, and so I got my brother-in-law to go with me, and he grew up in L.A., and he was really scared. I mean, it was fun, but it was very unnerving. I mean, through him, because I think it's also particularly in Los Angeles, there's a real sense because of the pervasiveness and visible wealth and strength of the Church of Scientology in some ways, and it's the fact that it permeates the entertainment industry, at least to a certain degree, that there's an additional kind of charge to it in Los Angeles. I mean, as an Angelino, Maja, could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's huge. I used to live over in Hollywood, and I actually went into the center there, the big one that's on L. Ron Hubbard Street, and just to check it out, and it's like Julian said, I was subjected to hours and hours of all this information on how rad Scientology is, to the extent that some of the DVDs would even say, if you leave here without joining, you're stupid. They actually say those words. So it's this kind of just assault on your brain, and they're predatory. I kind of felt like they sit on the streets and they try to get you in, and they kind of prey on these thespians that come here from all over the country, Kansas or whatever. They want to come and be big stars, and then they say, hey, you can come hang out with us. We know lots of actors. We'll help hook you up with acting groups, and so it's a force to be reckoned with, without question.
I also wanted to ask you, Julian, a little bit more about trolling. I mean, it seems that one of the things that's interesting to me about as we try to get a large understanding of the internet, or a big map for what's going on, is the way that it's changed our psychology, or almost acted as a kind of, it's like a collective space of our emotions and our desires and our anxieties, and it feeds back with our individual situations, but it also has its own kind of weird collective dimension that has ended up shifting in some ways quite powerfully our general sense of who we are. I mean, we don't have to talk about it now, but just to think about the role of the pervasiveness of pornography and the amplification of odd sexual practices in a way that now it's just sort of a pervasive part of all of our consciousness, that there's this whole rich realm that exists in a way that was very, very different even a couple decades ago. And, sexuality is such a powerful part of our experience that obviously this indicates not just that there's a place to go to get free porn, but that there's a kind of shift. You can argue about how intense and how significant, but there's a real fundamental shift about our psychological orientation. And I think another aspect of that is precisely this sort of culture of griefing, this culture of this sort of intensely adolescent, in some ways, aggressive, funny, obviously very male kind of atmosphere or an attitude that you could argue that in earlier cultural forms was somehow more constrained or more located in particular cultures in high school, or certain ways that certain subgroups would find each other. And now there's this medium which is historically associated a lot with young males who were a lot of the kinds of people who were drawn to hacking and drawn to computers when they're teenagers and they get into it, and suddenly now it's become something that's it's like loose. It's part of our own. We all have that adolescence inside of us. We all have that snarkiness and that kind of mean humor, but yet it's sort of reflected in a different way. I mean, I know you've been looking at this stuff for a long time. Can you try to talk about a little bit about how you see the significance of this sort of kind of psychological flavor in the internet culture now?
Well, there are a lot of dimensions to it, and I think you've hit on a lot of them. But the one that I keep coming back to is that there is almost an ethical dimension to it, not necessarily moral in the sense that the anonymous protesters might complain about things getting too moralistic in Scientology, but there is this ethical dimension that is peculiar to the internet, where precisely that issue we were talking about earlier of, oh my God, people come to realize that this world impinges on their real life in sometimes heavy ways. There is a flip side to that. It is a highly mediated world, nonetheless, and the ways that it impinges aren't always as obvious as they seem, and as people tend to take them at first blush. So, one of the reasons I came back to Grieper culture after spending so long talking about that article, Rape in Cyberspace, is I was seeing people were taking it way too seriously on the other hand, getting calls from journalists all over the world saying, can you, talk to us about this problem of rape online, which is a very serious problem? Well, no, it was a weird little story from, a weird little community that if you paid close attention to it would tell you sort of that things can be heavy online, but at the same time you had to be aware of the flip side, which is that they're not heavy. They're not heavy at all. They're light as air. And there is almost... So I've come to see the trolls almost as a kind of shock troop of, jesters trying to remind us of that constantly. And that's very clearly part of their ethic, is that they're constantly looking for people who are taking things too seriously online, and they're going to go mess with them. I mean, you might think of them as like the Zen master who whacks you with a stick when you're starting to go off into worlds of mind that aren't really here and now.
That's a beautiful way of phrasing it. I mean, I thought of it a lot in terms of identification, that as we translate ourselves online, we're going through this fascinating, spooky, playful process of negotiating how much we identify with these online environments and the characters we are and the people we are online. And so there's this immense shift of points of identification of the self. And what it seems like these guys are reminding us is that if identity is always constructed anywhere to some degree, it's way more constructed online, and right. that we have to acknowledge that and remember that as we go through this translation process, that there's a real danger, it's almost a deeper danger, in taking things too seriously or in believing with too much confidence that we are fully translated into our online selves and our online concerns. So it's like that trickster element, that Zen stick element, seems important not just as a way to keep people off their high horses, but to almost remind us that part of the modern mediated consciousness, a completely crucial part of it, is an awareness that we are mediated, is an awareness that we're constructing this world within which we play through our identities or make politics based on our identities. So it's a fascinating aspect of this group mind. This kind of, it's like a little bit of the negative that runs through and keeps things on their toes. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah, otherwise it would all be Lord of the Flies on like all these internet groups. Everyone would just go nuts.
I know we don't have very much time left. Are you still as massive a gamer as you have been in the past, Julian?
I still play a lot of World of Warcraft. I'm not going to lie, but I have. As you know, I spent a year buying and selling virtual items from online role-playing games, and then wrote a book about that called Play Money. I'm no longer doing that. I mean, I've gone so far into the gamer mindset that I almost can't understand why people would pay, for the items that get them through the game faster. I mean, to me, it's like paying somebody to watch television for you. But yeah, I do a lot of World of Warcraft, and part of that is I'm in a guild that's all other online game researchers. So on the one hand, it actually is one of those moments where your online life is really crossing over to and helping to constitute your real professional life. And on the other hand, it's a great excuse to play like a lunatic.
Well, one of the reasons I brought it up is that I've always appreciated your work because I'm not a gamer, but I'm fascinated by it. And in the parallel universe right next door, I'm a total World of Warcraft fanatic. But in this one, I'm not. So I love keeping up with you because you tell me about things that are happening, and so I can't resist but asking, like, what's going on now? What are people talking about on World of Warcraft? What's the issue? What's the conflict of the day?
Well, the World of Warcraft is growing up and getting very mainstream. It doesn't generate a lot of really fun stuff anymore. The game to watch right now is EVE Online, which I think has about 300,000 subscribers, as opposed to World of Warcraft having 11 million. But the difference is EVE Online, World of Warcraft is broken up into a jillion little servers where only 10,000 people ever interact, or 10 or 20. EVE Online, all of these people are in the same universe. So it's not only the hugest online game there's ever been, but if you look at like pieces on the playing board and players on the playing board, it's clearly the largest single game that has ever been played in the history of this planet. And it is generating some astonishing tales of intergroup warfare, people spending years and years infiltrating enemy groups and then destroying their entire empire in one fell act of treachery. And when you destroy an empire in EVE Online, because it's made out of objects that buy and sell for real money in these sort of parallel markets, you can say, well, this person's empire was worth millions of dollars, or this group's empire, and it was just destroyed like that. So they're playing for incredibly high stakes and really pushing the limits of how far you can let people really mess with each other.
When a group goes down in one of these acts of treachery, does their loot transfer, or does it disappear?
A little of both. Sometimes it'll just be the other team takes over their loot, but often it's just destroyed value.
What is the metaphor? What's the world like of this?
Oh, it's a space opera type world. It's incredibly geeky. I mean, whereas in World of Warcraft you're a fuzzy little character running around with an axe. In this, you're just a spaceship. You kind of have a little static picture of your character up in the corner, but it's all about fleets of spaceships rocketing through the outer depths, and it's an incredibly intellectual, abstract game where it's all about keeping spreadsheets of all your resources and things like that. But the kinds of drama that go on are indeed dramatic. These alliances of Russians and Americans ganging up on Europeans because they can straddle two time zones, and it's very arcane and dramatic.
Do you feel that that online gaming culture is just going to keep spreading, or do you think it's just like there's a certain subset people who are going to be drawn to it, and that it'll reach a sort of general saturation point, and the rest of us will be like, oh, that's interesting. There's gaming going on. It's a parallel world. Or do you see it as really growing as a more and more dominant metaphor that may end up weaving its way into our normal or our straight lives more and more intensely as the decades go on and the technology gets better and better?
Well, there's this sort of specific reality, and then, like you said, the metaphor. And I don't think they're that different, but to address the first, I think there's all kinds of varieties of online game are constantly being invented. If 11 million World of Warcraft players turns out to be all that there will be some other Facebook-based online game that will capture the other people who weren't interested in World of Warcraft. I mean, even you, Erik, I'm sure one day will meet the game that will consume you.
I look forward to it when I'm an oldster.
Yeah, well, it's a good way to spend your retirement. But on a broader level, I think what we've seen with this bleed over of the economies, where people will pay real money for World of Warcraft gold, and therefore factories have been set up in China where dudes are being paid $0.25 an hour to play World of Warcraft and harvest gold that then gets sold to Western players at high markups. We're starting to see that capital is starting to recognize the productive elements of play, and is able to sort of extract value from not just people's labor, but from their play.
I wonder if someday it'll cross over into politics, too, like Obama will get all pissed at Russia because Russia, stole his Warcraft gold or something.
Well, anytime there's real resources at play, that kind of thing can happen. But, it's more the first tendrils of this that you're starting to see are things like the Google image labeler game, right, where Google has all these images that they want to tag in a way that makes them as searchable as text content is. But there's way too much of it for them to automatically do it. So what are they? They've created a little game where you log in and you're matched up with someone you can't communicate with, except that you're both shown the same image and you're both in real time trying to put labels on it that will match what the other person thinks the label should be. So if you see a label of you see a picture of Christina Aguilera, you'll start typing singer, blonde, Aguilera, and hopefully...
All right, kids, that's the sound of wrapping it up. Julian Dibbell, his new article on the Scientology is on the Wired website. Thanks so much for tuning in to Expanding Mind, and thanks, Julian and Maja.
Thank you.
Thank you.